quiet knock, just once, just before midnight. It echoed through a house drowning in secrets, not loud enough to wake the world, but sharp enough to haunt a conscience. What began as a whisper in the dark soon unravelled into a mystery of guilt, silence, and justice disguised in shadows. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a dreary November evening, heavy with mist and shadow, that I found myself once more seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our lodgings at Baker Street. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering fingers across the Persian rug, while the city beyond our window groaned beneath a weight of soot and silence. Holmes, in one of his more melancholic moods, had taken up the violin, and its thin, wistful notes seemed to drift through the fog itself. It was on such nights, when the world grew silent and Holmes turned inward, that the strangest cases most often found their way to us. There was a peculiar stillness in Holmes that evening, a tension not of fatigue, but of some inward anticipation. He played not for pleasure, nor even for thought, but, I suspected, to occupy the silence that pressed about him. I had seen this restlessness before, once before the arrival of the Red-Headed League, and again on the eve of the Copper Beeches affair. When Holmes falls quiet like that, the world is rarely far from surrendering one of its secrets. Then came the knock. It was not loud, but it was precise. 3 short raps, each distinct and measured, with none of the hesitance of a drunkard or the cheer of a social visitor. Holmes paused mid-stroke and looked to the door, his brow arching slightly. "Curious," he murmured. "We are not expecting company, are we, Watson?" I had scarcely risen when he added, "And yet whoever it is knows to arrive without being seen. The fog cloaks more than chimneys tonight." There was something in the tone of those knocks that stirred even my soldier's nerves. Mrs. Hudson, as startled as I, had not reached the threshold before Holmes waved her aside and opened the door himself. A man stood in the entryway, cloaked against the damp and hunched slightly, as though weighed down by something other than the weather. His hat was drawn low, his collar high, and yet even in such concealment, his eyes darted like those of a hunted creature. "Please," he whispered, "I must not be seen here." Holmes stood aside, gesturing him in with a grace that implied expectation rather than surprise. As the stranger stepped into the warmth of our sitting room, I noted little more than his obvious distress. But Holmes, without a word, had already begun his silent inventory. I could see his eyes flicker toward the man's gloves, too thin for the season, and linger on the shine of his boots, more polished than fashionable. The visitor's posture bore the unmistakable rigidity of military training, yet the man's trembling hands belied discipline. Ink stains on his right thumb told of recent paperwork, though not of leisure. Holmes said nothing, but I could tell he had seen more than I. The clock on the mantel chimed the quarter, and Holmes, folding his hands beneath his chin, turned to our visitor. "You are precisely 3 minutes early," he said with a glance at the timepiece. "Midnight has a strange gravity for men with secrets, does it not?" The man said nothing, but his expression tightened. Holmes gestured to the armchair opposite him. "Come, sir, you are not here out of whim or weather. Tell us, then, what spectre pursues you through this fog, and why it knocks when others sleep." The man hesitated, and in that moment of silence I noticed how his gloved hand trembled slightly as it reached for the chair Holmes had offered. "You may call me H. Yishimuk," he began, but Holmes gave a soft, knowing cough. "We shall, of course, call you by your true name, Colonel Thomas Harrington, late of the 32nd Bengal Infantry, unless you insist on subterfuge." The man froze. I saw a flicker of something pass over his face, surprise perhaps, or resignation. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then removed his gloves with a care that suggested habit more than courtesy. "I suppose," he said, voice now low and hoarse, It was inevitable I would end up here. Holmes made no reply. He merely leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, and waited with the patient stillness of a spider that knows the fly is already too deep within the web to flee. "I did not come here for indulgence, Mr. Holmes," said Harrington. "I am not a man given to superstition or melodrama." His voice held the sharp edge of a soldier's discipline, but I could hear something beneath it, something that trembled. 3 years ago, on the 13th of November, my elder brother Edward died. An accident. At least that is what the inquest declared. He paused. But ever since that night, on each anniversary of his death, there have been 3 knocks at the door of Harrington Hall, precisely at midnight. Always 3, always the same. Loud, deliberate, and utterly inexplicable. I felt a shiver pass through me, not from fear, but from the man's certainty. "You believe it to be a spirit, Colonel?" I asked. He shook his head with something approaching disgust. "I believe in no such thing, but the sounds are real. They have been heard not only by me, but by my staff, by my guests, by my own physician, and yet never once has a soul been found at the door." He leaned forward. "This is the 3rd year, Doctor. The 4th falls in 6 nights, and I do not believe I shall see a 5th. Harrington's voice fell to a hush as he described the atmosphere that should grip the estate each November. "It is as though the house itself anticipates the hour," he said. "The servants whisper in corridors. No one remains awake past 10. Guests who once stayed in the West Wing have made excuses never to return." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Has the knocking always occurred in the same location?" "Yes," Harrington said, "at the main entrance. 3 precise knocks. Never sooner, never later. And no intruder has been seen fleeing?" "None," the Colonel replied. "I have stood with pistol in hand, 5 feet from the door, and flung it open within seconds. Nothing, not a soul in sight. And yet, the knocks ring through the hall like cannon fire." The words struck me more deeply than I care to admit. There was something about the uniformity of the event that made it worse than a ghost story. It felt like a ritual. "It is not merely repetition that unnerves me," said Harrington, his hands clasped tightly on his knee. "It is escalation." He spoke of how the 1st year's knocks had been faint, barely audible, the 2nd, firmer, and last year they had been violent. "The 3rd blow rattled the stained glass," he said. "I fear what the 4th will bring." Holmes, who had listened in silence thus far, finally leaned forward. "Your brother," he said. "You say it was an accident. A riding incident, yes?" "Yes," Harrington replied. "Thrown from his mare on the moor road, struck his head on a rock, died instantly." "And you were with him at the time?" No, I was not." The pause between question and answer had been slight, but Holmes noticed. I saw it in the subtle lift of his brow. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "And the inquest accepted this version?" "Yes," Harrington said too quickly. "There was no evidence to the contrary." Holmes rose, crossing to the window as though to study the fog. "Indeed. But there often isn't, Colonel, until one knocks loudly enough." The Colonel said nothing, but his fingers curled tighter around the edge of the chair. It was in a quiet aside, once Harrington had stepped out to take a moment's air, that Holmes spoke to me in low tones. "You noticed his reference to Bengal service?" "Of course," I replied. "He was posted there, like many officers of his generation." "Quite. And yet I recall something more particular. An opium scandal in Calcutta, hushed up quickly. The name Harrington appeared once, then vanished from the record." Holmes's voice was cool, almost amused. "You may also note that accidents among such officers often conceal less palatable truths." "You think the brother knew something?" I asked. Holmes gave a dry smile. "Watson, I think the dead brother knew everything, and I think our colonel is more haunted by the living than the departed." At that moment, the door creaked and Harrington reappeared, his composure seemingly restored. But I could not help feeling that Holmes had glimpsed some fracture within the man, one that no mere knock had caused. Holmes resumed his chair and invited the Colonel to continue. Yet even as the man spoke of creaking corridors and ghostly legends, Holmes's gaze remained fixed, not upon Harrington's eyes, but his hands. "Curious," he said lightly, "how war leaves its traces not only on the mind, but on the fingers." "I beg your pardon?" Harrington asked, stiffening. "The half-healed burn on your left knuckle, for instance, the kind left by an oil lamp, or sealing wax, perhaps, and the fraying on your right cuff, too even to be the work of time, likely chewed by acid ink, which explains the blue residue on your thumb." Harrington blinked. "You write often and nervously," Holmes continued, "but not letters. Documents, perhaps. Legal ones." The Colonel shifted in his seat, and I sensed the chill that had re-entered the room had little to do with the November air. "Fascinating," Holmes said with a smile. "Please, go on." When Harrington finally departed, after declining tea and glancing too many times toward the curtained window, Holmes remained still for some minutes. He did not reach for his violin or his pipe. He merely stared at the fire which had burned low, until I finally ventured, "What do you make of him, Holmes?" "He is not a liar, Watson," he said at last, "but neither is he honest." "A paradox, a familiar one," he replied. "He believes what he says because he has constructed the story so thoroughly that he dare not question it. But guilt is a stubborn companion. It always finds a crack." I frowned. "You think he fears punishment?" Holmes shook his head. "No, he fears discovery. There is a difference. One may face punishment with courage, but to be known, truly known, that, Watson, is what unnerves men like Harrington." I thought back to the clenched fists, the guarded glances, the subtle tremor in his voice. "He spoke of the fourth knock as if it were a final act," I murmured. "Because it is," Holmes said, "though not perhaps in the way he expects." He stood suddenly. "Pack your coat, Watson. We are going to Harrington Hall." The following morning found us bound for Devonshire, our train cutting through fog and frost as if England itself wished to remain hidden. Holmes was in high spirits, which is to say, he had entered that cool, calculating state of near silence that signalled his mind was already 10 moves ahead of the rest of us. He spoke only once during the journey, and then only to remark that Colonel Harrington had used the phrase precisely at midnight no fewer than 4 times. "Which, Watson," he added, "is the linguistic tick of a man rehearsing an alibi rather than recounting an ordeal." From the station, we took a small trap through narrow lanes and eventually onto a desolate stretch of moorland. The wind swept across the hills in long, mournful sighs, and I could not help but recall our adventure in Baskerville country some years prior. "There's something unnatural about Devon mist," I muttered. Holmes gave a tight-lipped smile. "Yes, it insists on dressing its ghosts with excellent timing." As we approached the Harrington estate, the air seemed to thicken. The trees stood motionless, and the iron gates groaned, as though reluctant to admit us. If the house held answers, it did not give them easily. Harrington Hall was a vast, square structure of the Jacobean style, its stonework darkened by decades of soot and sorrow. The facade bore the stern lines of a house unused to laughter, and the windows stared outward like eyes that had grown weary of what they'd seen. We were greeted by a butler whose gait betrayed military origins and whose face bore the permanent stoop of long service and short patience. Inside, the house creaked with each step, the floors groaning as though annoyed by the disturbance. The portraits that lined the corridors stared down with cold, patrician disapproval, and even Holmes, a man rarely moved by atmosphere, seemed momentarily still as we passed through the main hallway. Colonel Harrington awaited us in the drawing room, more composed than he had been in Baker Street, but no less pale. He offered no pleasantries. "It's always colder in here," he said, "even with the fire lit." Holmes replied with a glance toward the walls. "Old houses remember things, Colonel. Whether they share them depends upon how well one listens." We followed him deeper into the manor. The hush of the place was not merely architectural, it was the silence of a home holding its breath. The sitting room in which the phenomena occurred lay at the far western edge of the estate, a narrow chamber with high panelled walls, a heavily curtained bay window, and a fireplace of black marble that had long since lost its shine. Holmes moved through the space with unhurried purpose, his eyes skimming the details most men would overlook. I saw him pause by the door, fingers tracing a faint groove in the oak panel. He then turned his attention to the grandfather clock in the corner. "An odd placement," he murmured. "The chime is inaudible from the hallway." He opened the casing, revealing not the expected brass gears, but a hollowed compartment, recently dusted, though the rest of the room bore age undisturbed. His expression shifted, just slightly. Holmes then crossed to the wall opposite the fireplace, running a hand along the wainscot. He stopped at a section no different to my eyes, but gave it a firm rap. The sound echoed dully, not as wood should echo. "Watson," he said, "do you hear that?" I did, a hollow beneath, something large. "It would appear," Holmes said softly, "that this room does not keep all its secrets above the floorboards." Holmes requested access to the estate's library, a grand chamber of dust-laden volumes and ancient varnish, its upper gallery lined with rows of forgotten knowledge. "Most men store secrets near their books," he said, running his fingers lightly along the spines. He paused at a shelf of ledgers, tapped the second from the right, and withdrew it. The shelf did not creak, but gave a slight inward resistance. "Ah," he murmured, "hinges behind Hume. Predictable." With delicate pressure, he eased the shelf back, revealing a small recess perhaps 2 feet wide. Within it lay an empty tin, a candle stub, and a sheaf of the yellowing paper tied with twine. Holmes studied them briefly. "Not criminal," he concluded, "but clandestine. Someone's been hiding here, not what they stole, but what they feared might be taken." I asked what it meant. "It means," he replied, eyes gleaming, "that not all hauntings knock at the front door." We found Mr. Collins polishing a decanter in the drawing room, his back straight and eyes blank of anything that might be interpreted as curiosity. Holmes greeted him with formal politeness and asked if he had been present on the night of Colonel Harrington's brother's death. "I was, sir," Collins replied evenly. "I laid out the brandy in the blue salon, as was customary. I retired shortly thereafter. And on the nights of the knocks," Collins paused briefly. "I've heard them, yes. So have others." Holmes tilted his head. "And you've investigated?" "I am a servant, sir, not a detective. Yet I suspect you have observed more than some detectives," Holmes said softly. Collins gave no response. As we turned to leave, Holmes added, "Tell me, did Colonel Harrington and his brother argue often?" "I do not eavesdrop, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave a faint smile. "You don't need to. Your silence says enough." Miss Beatrice Lane, the housekeeper, received us in her parlour with the stiff courtesy of one who tolerated but did not trust outsiders. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her voice had the slight tremor of a woman used to whispering behind closed doors. "I don't like speaking of it, Doctor," she said when I broached the subject. "The house has had bad air since Mr. Edward died. Things go missing. Windows open themselves." Holmes interjected. "You believe in spirits, Miss Lane?" She met his gaze, firm. "I believe in grief, Mr. Holmes, and secrets, and in those who would rather one be mistaken for the other." He smiled faintly. A sound distinction. I asked if she thought the Colonel was in danger. "I think," she said slowly, "that whatever is coming to this house already knows his name. It's only waiting for the clock." Holmes did not laugh, nor did I. Later that afternoon, Holmes asked to be shown the rear terrace, a stone-paved promenade overlooking the woods. Rain had recently fallen, and the corners of the paving bore the faint impressions of boot heels. Holmes crouched low, eyes narrowing. "3 sets," he muttered. "2 recent, 1 older." I squinted. "You can tell their age?" The moss is disturbed here, he pointed, and undisturbed there. This pair, size 9, left slightly outward, walked through yesterday. The other, larger, worn heel, deeper impression, sometime last week. He straightened. But that, he added, is the oddity. What is? There's no record of the return. These footprints lead toward the house, but there are none leading back. Could the person have entered? Holmes nodded. Yes, the question is, when did they leave? And why has no one noticed a guest who never came? His eyes lifted toward the second-floor windows. I fear the house has more inhabitants than it admits. At dinner, the Colonel made passing mention of a former stable hand, a boy named Gilbert, who had left the estate abruptly a month prior. Holmes, never one to ignore an aside, inquired further. Ran off, did he? He asked. That is what I was told, Harrington replied with a frown. Beatrice handled it. Said the boy had grown restless, left without notice. The matter might have ended there, but Holmes insisted upon visiting the stables before dusk. There, amidst the scent of damp straw and the silence of the empty stalls, he examined a row of bridles, then paused beside an unused hayloft. Watson, he said, would you pass me that lantern? He climbed the ladder and peered within. Moments later, he called down. There's a boot print in the dust, and a woolen scarf. I joined him, heart quickening. No spider makes a web where it feeds, Holmes said, which means someone wanted the boy gone, or hidden. You think he's still here? I whispered. I think, Holmes replied, eyes dark, that someone in this house cannot risk him being found. The wind whistled across the stable doors like a whisper of warning, and the cold settled deeper in my spine than any night chill. The household had long since retired when Holmes and I settled into the drawing room once more. The lamps were turned low, the fire reduced to embers, and even the ticking of the clock seemed hesitant. Holmes had requested that the servants avoid the west wing entirely that evening. Only we two remained, seated in silence on either side of the hearth, waiting, not with superstition, but with sharpened nerve. Holmes appeared unusually still, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed not on any object but somewhere inward. He had neither smoked nor spoken for nearly an hour. I, on the other hand, found the quiet oppressive and was half tempted to break it with some remark when he held up a single finger. I froze. It was nearing the hour. Outside, the wind scratched at the shutters. I watched the clock creep toward 12. The weight of the house seemed to shift, something intangible pressing against the walls themselves. Holmes breathed in through his nose and exhaled very slowly. And then it came. 3 knocks. Sharp, deliberate, perfectly spaced. Holmes did not move, but his head turned, not toward the front door. He turned toward the east wall. There was a long silence after the final knock. I sat frozen in my chair, uncertain whether I had truly heard what I thought I had. But Holmes was already on his feet, head tilted slightly, his gaze fixed on the far wall of the sitting room, the wall opposite the fireplace, where a tall cabinet of maps and nautical charts stood undisturbed. You heard it too, he said quietly. Of course, I replied. It came from the hall. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. It only seemed to. Your ears were deceived. Acoustics are treacherous things. He stepped forward and tapped his knuckles along the wall. Slowly, methodically. His expression sharpened when he reached the corner beside the cabinet. Here, he said. Do you feel the difference? I approached, pressing my hand against the panel. It was faint, but I could detect a subtle reverberation, an unnatural hollowness. Holmes crouched and examined the skirting board, which bore scratches invisible at a casual glance. This is no ordinary wall, he murmured. It carries sound. To where? I asked. Holmes stood, already moving. Not to where, Watson, from whom? And with that, he crossed the room and pulled back the hearthrug with a flourish. Look here, Holmes said, crouching before the hearth as I joined him. The fireplace was cold, The ashes swept clean. Too clean, I thought, for a hearth unused in winter. Holmes reached into the blackened recess and gave the back panel a firm knock. It rang not with stone, but with a muffled thud, as though something lay beyond it. Clever, he mused. A flue designed not to carry smoke, but sound. I blinked. A chimney that doesn't vent upward? Indeed, it travels downward, into the foundations of the house. An inverted shaft, perhaps. Observe the soot lines. There are none. This has never been used for fire. With delicate precision, Holmes located a hidden latch inside the left wall of the hearth and depressed it. There was a dull metallic click, and the entire grate shifted slightly. He pulled it forward and slid it aside, revealing a narrow chute, no wider than a man's shoulder. Extraordinary, I breathed. The knocks do not come from the door, Holmes said, his voice echoing faintly into the shaft. They are sent from below, amplified by this conduit. It is a device designed to haunt. To frighten Harrington, I asked. To remind him, Holmes replied. Of what? I cannot yet say. He stood, brushing soot from his fingers. But I intend to ask the chimney directly, and without another word, he vanished down into the dark. The air grew heavier as I followed Holmes down a narrow stone passage that curved beneath the floor of the west wing. We descended into a hidden cellar, its existence entirely unknown to the servants, or so they claimed. A single lantern cast long shadows across the walls, revealing crude bedding in one corner and the remains of several food tins, their labels foreign and unfamiliar. Holmes said nothing at first. He moved silently, his gaze sharp. Beside the makeshift cot sat a battered satchel, the kind used by soldiers. He knelt and opened it. Inside lay a tattered military pouch, its canvas frayed, the crest of a now defunct Indian regiment barely visible in the flickering light. Holmes extracted it gently, as one might handle a wounded animal. A ghost with boots and rations, he said quietly. This is no haunting. This is residence. On the wall above the bedding, someone had marked time, scratched lines in groups of 3, one for each year. Someone has been living here, I whispered, waiting, listening. Holmes nodded. And if I am not mistaken, the past he listens for is very much alive. He rose, eyes cold. The Colonel is not being haunted, Watson. He is being hunted. Holmes examined the canvas pouch with the delicate touch of a man sifting through the fossil of a vanished truth. He turned it gently in his hands, then held it up to the light. See here, he said, pointing to a faded patch of embroidery barely clinging to the edge. That insignia, what remains of it, belongs to the 43rd Madras Field Prison Company, decommissioned in '82 after the insurrection at Nagercoil. You're certain? I asked, positively. The starburst insignia with the narrow crescent, worn only by that regiment. And look here, beneath the flap. He drew back the edge of the pouch to reveal a stitched set of initials. R.D. I should think this once belonged to a man named Ravi Das, Holmes said calmly. The name sent a strange chill through me. It seemed both familiar and foreign, like a spectre half remembered from a fevered dream. Holmes's voice dropped. Colonel Harrington once commanded this very unit, Watson, which means this cellar, this pouch, these knockings, are not echoes from a ghost. They are messages from someone who knows precisely which nerve to touch. He paused, then added softly, and who remembers a truth that the Colonel tried very hard to bury. Holmes stood in the middle of the hidden cellar, silent for a time. Then, in that slow, deliberate tone he reserved for the most uncomfortable truths, he said, We are not dealing with a madman, Watson, nor a spectre. This is something far more unnerving, a man with discipline. He gestured to the layout of the room, the clean arrangement of tins, the folded blanket, the evenly spaced candle stubs. See how precise it is. This is not the lair of a frightened fugitive. It's the quarters of someone trained, someone with the habits of soldiering still intact. I glanced again at the markings on the wall. 3 scratches, each year, I murmured. He's counting, Holmes said. He's marking anniversaries, but not with mourning, with patience. And you believe this is Ravidas? Who else would possess both the motive and the nerve to return from the dead with such calculated menace? I said nothing, for I had no answer, but Holmes continued, eyes narrowed in thought. He hasn't harmed anyone, not yet. His aim is psychological. He knocks, he waits, he watches the man he once called superior slowly collapse under the weight of his guilt. He looked at me. That, Watson, is the craft of vengeance. As we made our way back through the narrow passage, Holmes finally broke the silence with a sentence I shall not soon forget. There are crimes, Watson, so well concealed by uniform and honour that they outlive the empire itself. He went on to recount, in his typically dispassionate manner, the tale of a scandal that had briefly surfaced during Harrington's final years in India. It had concerned an illicit opium route operated under the protection of certain British officers, hidden behind false inspections and redirected supply manifests. Most damning of all, Holmes said, was that Edward Harrington, the elder brother, had allegedly discovered the operation and threatened to report it. But before he could, Holmes said, his horse threw him, and no one questioned the accident. I stared at him. You believe Edward was murdered? I believe Edward was inconvenient. That is often the more persuasive motive. And Ravidas, a prison clerk, transferred abruptly, then declared dead after a riot. But there was no body, and the name vanished. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar. Then these knocks are the sound of conscience, Watson, not Harrington's, but the world's, returned to call the account due. That evening, as we sat once more by the fire, Holmes spoke not as the cold rationalist I knew, but as a man reviewing a page already half written. I believe Ravidas never died, he said. I believe he escaped. Perhaps with help, perhaps alone. But I believe he came back, to England, to this house. Not to kill, but to unmake. To unmake what, I asked. The illusion, he replied, of justice, of brotherhood, of empire. He does not need to confront Harrington, merely to remain as an unanswered knock at midnight, a ghost, not of death, but of truth. I stared at the firelight flickering against the iron grate, and the boy in the stables likely saw him, perhaps even aided him, perhaps was warned to disappear. But make no mistake, Das has walked these floors, studied this house, lived beneath it like a second conscience. He paused, then added almost to himself, It is one thing to survive betrayal, Watson. Another entirely to live long enough to make your betrayer look in the mirror and see your face. And then, as if the thought satisfied some inward ledger, Holmes rose. It is time, he said, to stop the knocking, one way or another. Holmes had instructed Colonel Harrington to vacate the manor for the evening under the pretext of security reinforcements arriving from the constabulary. The servants, too, had been quietly dismissed to the village with sealed instructions and modest bribes, which Holmes assured me were a justified investment in silence. Thus, by 10 o'clock, Harrington Hall was utterly still. We sat in the drawing room, Holmes in his favoured high-backed chair, I by the hearth, while the wind pressed gently against the windows and the grandfather clock measured out each minute with an exaggerated solemnity. Holmes had locked all doors but one. The front remained unlatched, the hearth cold, the fire deliberately darkened. A tripwire, thin as a spider's strand, had been set across the threshold and connected to a bell above the doorframe. Holmes, fiddling idly with his pocket watch, said without looking up, There is a particular rhythm to revenge, Watson. It's rarely hasty. It waits for stillness, for perfect symmetry. I asked what symmetry the night provided. This is the 4th year, he replied. The 4th knock. A soldier once condemned, a brother once betrayed. It completes the equation. And then he closed the watch with a snap, leaned back and added, Midnight, I think, will not be late. The moment came without flourish. The house, which had been quiet as a grave, seemed to hold its breath. The clock struck 12. Then knock. A single, low boom reverberated through the hallway. Knock. Louder this time, as though a fist had clenched. Knock. The final sound echoed not like wood upon wood, but like a blow struck against memory itself. It rang with fury, with accusation. The bell on the tripwire gave a single jingle. Holmes rose at once, every movement unhurried, yet precise. "He is earlier than expected," he remarked. "He has grown confident." I followed him into the passage. There, the door, ajar only inches, stood trembling upon its hinges. Holmes raised a hand, signalling silence. With a deliberate motion, he pushed it open, and there he stood. A man cloaked in heavy wool, face shadowed by a broad-brimmed hat, stood within the doorway. He did not speak. He did not startle. He merely looked from Holmes to myself, and then down to the threshold as if he knew precisely what he had triggered. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You chose the 4th year. Why?" The figure did not answer, but he stepped inside, slowly, soundlessly, with the gait not of a phantom, but of a soldier. Holmes gestured toward the drawing room. "Come in then," he said, voice flat. "You've knocked long enough." And the man obeyed. As the figure stepped into the lamplight, I saw at once that he was no apparition. He was lean, perhaps of middle age, his eyes dark and sunken beneath the brim of his hat. His skin bore the tinge of long sun exposure, not English in hue, yet not wholly foreign either. His coat, though heavy and concealing, revealed beneath it boots of warm military leather, meticulously shined. Holmes closed the door behind him, not as captor nor host, but as if finality required ceremony. "You've been below this house for some time," he said. Still, the man said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. "You were once in the 43rd Madras Field Prison Company. Your insignia remains on your kit. You served under Colonel Harrington, and you were left for dead in a riot that history no longer records." Now the man raised his head. "I am not here to kill him," he said in low, steady tones. "I am here to let him die the way he lived, under false pretenses." I confess a chill passed through me. There was something terrible in the restraint of that voice. Holmes met it with his own. "And what is it you want from us?" The man answered, "Only that someone finally listen." He removed his hat with deliberate care, revealing close-cropped hair streaked with grey, and a scar that curved along his left temple. "My name is Ravi Das," he said, "and I have been dead for 17 years. He sat when Holmes gestured, upright, dignified, like a man's giving testimony in a trial that had no judge but truth. "I was a clerk in the prison unit Harrington commanded. I kept records, Watson, transfer rosters, cargo manifests, the names of men sent out of sight." He paused. "I found inconsistencies, opium shipments where there should have been flour, prisoners sent to factories that didn't exist. Harrington and a few others skimmed from the native quarter, covered by forged orders and vanished names. When I brought the ledger to his brother Edward, he promised to expose it." Ravi's voice hardened. "Edward died within a fortnight." "A horse accident," I murmured. "No," said Ravi, "an arranged fall. I heard them plan it, but I had already sent word to Delhi. You were caught," Holmes concluded, "beaten, transferred. A riot was arranged. I was presumed killed. And yet you lived. I escaped, hid, returned years later to find Harrington not punished, but honoured." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So you haunted him?" "I gave him truth," said Ravi. "Year by year, knock by knock. Let the fear he dealt return to his doorstep." "And what now?" I asked. He looked up. "Now you decide whether a ghost is a villain or a witness the world tried to forget." There was a moment, brief, brittle, when the air between us turned from memory to menace. Ravi Das, seated upright with that soldier's discipline, shifted slightly in his chair. A flicker no more than the twitch of a sleeve caught Holmes's eye. "Don't," Holmes said flatly, but Ravi's hand had already gone to his waist. In an instant, a narrow blade flashed into view, a Gurkha's knife, curved and ugly with old rust. He did not strike. He held it low, almost apologetically, as though memory alone had driven him to draw it. I stepped forward, but Holmes raised a single finger. "Mr. Das," Holmes said, not rising, "there are 3 things I do not permit inside a client's parlour: sentimentality, bad brandy, and assassination." The man tensed, then surged upward, but Holmes was faster. From beneath the hearthrug, Holmes triggered something I had not noticed: a length of fine wire attached to a spring bolt anchored in the floorboards. There was a hiss, a snap, and before I could even cry out, the blade clattered to the floor and Ravi Das had been dragged backwards and off balance, the wire cinched about his ankles. He landed hard, wind knocked from him. Holmes was already at his side, retrieving the weapon. "The blade is older than the lie," he murmured, "but less dangerous." I helped restrain the man, now coughing and deflated. "I was not going to kill," Ravi muttered bitterly. Holmes looked down. "And yet your hand did not know." What followed was not triumph, but silence. We had bound him gently, with Holmes insisting on a cushion beneath his head. "He is not the villain of this piece," he told me quietly. "Merely its echo." Ravi Das lay still for a time, eyes on the ceiling, jaw set in the way of men who have spoken truth and been punished for it. Then, without prompting, he spoke. "You were wrong about one thing, Doctor," he said. "Edward was not Harrington's only brother." Holmes glanced up from the confiscated knife. "Indeed. There was a third, James Harrington, younger, a clerk in the quartermaster's division. He had no rank, just family. It was through him that the papers flowed. He falsified the documents Edward never saw. He signed the death orders." I frowned. "He was never mentioned." "Because he died," Ravi said, "but not in India, in Portsmouth. He returned before the collapse of the company. He tried to extract himself. The others did not allow it." Holmes stood now. "And Colonel Harrington buried both the scandal and the brother." Ravi turned his face away. "Edward was going to speak. That is certain. He left me a note the day before he died, a scrap I have carried through 13 cities. 'If I am silenced,' he wrote, 'my brother's silence is the price.'" He paused, then added, "It was not Ravi Das who killed Edward. It was silence." Holmes was motionless for a moment, then spoke with grave clarity. "You came here to break that silence, not with gunfire, but with doubt." "I came," said Ravi, "to make him listen every night to the sound of memory. 3 knocks, 1 for each name erased." The man's face contorted, not with rage, but exhaustion. "You think I haunted him? No, I reminded him he was alive and did not deserve to be." Later, after the authorities had come and gone, after Ravi Das had been escorted not in chains, but in calm custody, Holmes and I remained. He did not speak for some time. He removed his gloves slowly, folding them with exaggerated precision, and then reached for his pipe. The match flared briefly, then died. A second took. At last, the familiar coils of smoke rose above his shoulder. I sat nearby, unsure whether silence was sympathy or study. "He won't hang," I said. "He hasn't killed." "No," Holmes replied. "But he has undone something, which, in its own way, is more dangerous." "You mean Harrington's reputation?" "I mean the lie that binds empires, Watson, the myth of clean hands." There was no mockery in his tone, only weariness. "He told the truth," I said. "He did," Holmes answered. "And truth has the curious property of echoing longer than any bullet." I thought of the 3 knocks, of the cold wind, of Harrington, now faced not with ghosts, but with history refusing to stay buried. Holmes turned to me then. "You know, Watson, I often think justice is not a sword, but a door. We assume we know what's behind it, and then someone knocks." We sat with that thought a while, the pipe between us glowing faintly. Outside, the wind shifted, and though no hand struck the wood, I could not help but hear, very faintly, the echo of 3 soft raps, somewhere deep beneath the floor. Holmes rose the next morning at an hour most men would consider uncivilized, save perhaps bakers and burglars. I found him writing a letter in that brisk, elegant hand of his, already sealed and addressed to Inspector Lestrade. "I trust you are sending for the Yard," I said, still yawning. "I am sending them not a criminal, Watson," he replied, "but a man whose crime lies in being more honourable than the system that condemned him." It was perhaps the most unexpected remark I had heard from him all week. Lestrade arrived not long after noon, his moustache twitching with suspicion before he'd even stepped over the threshold. "So what have we here, Mr. Holmes? Another ghost who confesses? Or some society widow worried her husband's cigar ash is suspiciously Turkish?" Holmes handed him the report with uncharacteristic gravity. "You will find, Inspector, that Mr. Ravi Das was declared dead in India, yet somehow managed to walk through Colonel Harrington's hallway last night." Lestrade glanced up. "A resurrection?" "No," Holmes replied. "A reckoning." I watched as Lestrade read the facts Holmes had assembled. The forged death certificate, the silent visits, the recovered knife, and finally, Ravi's own statement. "And what charge do you propose?" Lestrade asked, eyeing Holmes over the rim of his spectacles. "None," Holmes said. "Let the courts decide if truth-telling is now a criminal offence." Even Lestrade, hardened as he was, paused before nodding. "Very well, but I dare say this is the strangest case I've ever closed with an apology." As Lestrade and his men saw to the formalities, Holmes led me back to the drawing room. He stood before the cold fireplace, arms folded. "You asked me, Watson, how a knock could echo through 3 floors with no hand to strike it. Observe." He took a slender rod from his coat, a mere poker no thicker than a pencil, and tapped 3 times upon the cast-iron grate. The resulting sound was oddly muted. "Now," he said, and vanished into the corridor. Moments later, from the chimney shaft above, I heard a triple knock, this time clear, resonant, and uncanny. Holmes returned, brushing soot from his sleeve. "The shaft is hollow and unlined," he explained. "The inner walls curve inward near the top, a relic of hasty colonial construction. When struck from above at a specific angle, the sound refracts and blooms downward, dislocated from its source. Ingenious, really. One could haunt an entire house with nothing more than a stick and an understanding of geometry." "But how did he access the roof?" I asked. "Via the abandoned service ladder at the rear, the one masked by ivy," he replied. "Mr. Das made excellent use of old plans and older silence. I could not help but admire the bleak poetry of it. Knocks conjured not by spirits, but by a man returning from beyond his own grave, wielding sound like a summons." Holmes nodded slowly. "We are so easily unsettled, Watson. A creak, a tap, a shape in the dark, and we surrender logic in favour of fear. But this man chose his instrument wisely. Nothing terrifies the guilty quite like their own memory knocking to be let in. You recall," Holmes said as we returned to Baker Street that evening, "the brass regimental button I retrieved from beneath the stair-runner?" I nodded. "You said it was colonial." "Indeed, a match for the insignia of the 44th Madras Riflemen, a unit disbanded after the scandal you now understand. Only a handful of men retained uniform pieces. One was Edward Harrington, another was Ravi Das. And you used it to trace his survival. The metal bore corrosion patterns consistent not with Indian humidity, but with the chalky damp of the English coast. It had not lain in Calcutta, but in Canterbury." He handed me a paper. "A will," I read aloud, "signed by Edward Harrington. Supposedly drafted in 1897, said Holmes. "But it contains legal phrasing not standardized until 1899, 2 years after his death. A forgery, and a poor one. And the journal?" Holmes's eyes lit briefly. "That, Watson, was the key. A small, leather-bound book recovered from Ravi's possession, concealed in the lining of a travel bag. Edward's own hand, not only confirming the smuggling, but noting dates, names, and even amounts. The signature of James Harrington appears 6 times. Colonel Harrington's handwriting appears once, in the margin, beside the words, expendable asset. I swallowed. You always said, Holmes, that the truth is in the details. And those who fear the details, he said, often pay others to bury them. He tapped the journal with his finger. This, he said softly, was never about haunting, it was about remembering, and making sure that remembrance was no longer a private punishment. Colonel Harrington opened the door himself, a man carved from pride but hollowed by insomnia. Holmes said nothing at first. He handed over the journal, the forged will, and the declaration signed by Ravi Das. For a long moment, the old soldier did not speak. He looked down at the book, then back at Holmes, and finally at me. There was no defense in his eyes, only recognition, as though the ghosts he had kept at bay had finally taken visible form. I suppose you've come to ruin me, he said quietly. Holmes answered gently. I've come to end the haunting. The colonel sat down without protest. His hands, once used to drilling lines and marking orders, trembled as they turned each page. You must understand, he said at last. Edward was too honest. He thought truth was a ladder. Climb it and you are free. He didn't realize it was a pit. And so you buried him in it, I said, more bitterly than I intended. He looked up. No, I let others do the shoveling. I only failed to stop them. There was no rage, no shouting, not even the stubborn denial one expects from proud men caught by the law, only the weight of years pressing down. I've relived his final steps every night, he said. The stairs, the knock, the silence that followed. Holmes, uncharacteristically soft, offered no lecture. There are no legal charges yet, he said, but moral sentences are often the longest served. The colonel did not reply. He reached for the journal once more, not to destroy it, but to hold it, as one might cradle an urn. Outside, the wind stirred faintly through the yews, and in the hush that followed, I swear I heard a single solemn knock. Later that week, I found Holmes seated cross-legged upon the rug, cross-referencing newspaper clippings with a battered volume on colonial law. You still pursue the case? I asked. I pursue its meaning, he replied without looking up. Ravi Das remains in custody, though only formally. Scotland Yard is debating what to label him. Intruder, ghost, or witness inconvenient to empire. And what do you call him? Holmes closed the book with a snap. A revenant. A man returned not from death but from deliberate burial, the sort administered not by shovels but by documents. He stood, brushing ash from his sleeve. He trespassed, yes. He frightened a household, he carried a weapon, but he took no life, stole no coin, demanded no price. His only crime, Watson, was that he insisted on being remembered. I had seldom heard Holmes speak with such gravity. You believe him just? I believe him human, said Holmes, which is more than he was allowed in the official record. The man they left behind in Calcutta was not meant to return. His survival was an inconvenience, his truth, a liability. Holmes leaned toward the window. Do you know the most curious thing about ghosts, Watson? What? They are often more truthful than the living. Holmes and I returned once more to the Harrington estate, though the house now sat empty, its windows shuttered, and its silence of the more natural sort. He walked the halls slowly, pausing here and there with a distant expression. Everyone in this house, he murmured, played a role in the fiction, some knowingly, some by omission, but all contributed. I looked at him, puzzled. You recall the housekeeper's insistence that the pantry door stuck at night, that the dogs growled without provocation, that a wineglass shattered though no one touched it. I do. She feared a spirit, but truly she feared contradiction. She heard what she could not explain, and invented ghosts rather than suspect the master, safer that way. And the butler fostered the legend, not out of malice, but convenience. The more haunted the house, the fewer questions about who might be climbing the rear stair. I reflected on the odd silences of the household, the way servants exchanged glances, how no one ventured alone after dusk. They all felt it, didn't they? I said. The tension, the wrongness. They did, Holmes replied. But rather than name it, they masked it in superstition. Denial is a powerful but brittle mortar, Watson, and this house was built upon it. He placed his hand upon the newel post of the grand staircase. But sound, like truth, is persistent. It echoes, it rebounds, and eventually it finds a way through the cracks. He turned to me then, eyes sharper than I had seen them in days. Be wary of households that claim to be peaceful. They are often merely quiet. That evening, we sat once again in our Baker Street rooms, Holmes puffing steadily at his pipe, the fire casting long silhouettes against the far wall. He had refused supper, save for a single apple, which he sliced with deliberate precision. I find, he said, that cases of morality unsettle me more than those of violence. One can dissect murder with logic, but justice resists autopsy. I glanced up. You doubt we did right? I doubt the world has any consistent measure for what is right, Holmes replied. What the law permits, conscience may condemn, and what the law punishes, conscience may absolve. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. This man, Ravi Das, he returned not to steal, nor to slay, but to haunt. That was his method. His revenge was not fire or blood, but memory, a far more exquisite form. And effective, I added. Holmes allowed a rare smile. Indeed, he turned guilt into architecture. Every knock he delivered was not upon a door, but upon the mind. We sat in silence a moment longer. You believe he will be freed? I believe, Holmes said, that even empires flinch at ghosts. The fire snapped softly. Holmes reached for the lantern beside him and trimmed its flame. I sometimes wonder, Watson, he said, voice low, whether all houses aren't haunted, not by spirits, but by the truths we seal away in cupboards and behind portraits. He gazed into the flickering light. Truth walks slowly, he said, but it carries a lantern, and wherever it shines, shadows must answer. The clock chimed once. Neither of us moved. Outside, the city breathed, restless, ancient, and full of knocking things. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street, settling over the city like a reluctant curtain. Inside our rooms, the lamps flickered low, and the faint perfume of coal smoke lingered beneath the sharper scent of Holmes' shag tobacco. I sat for some time in the chair opposite him, watching the fire struggle against its own ashes. The case, if such a tangle of revenge, remorse, and revelation could be called by so concise a name, had drawn to a close. Yet my mind remained uneasily occupied. It was not the details that haunted me, but their weight. The knocks on the panel, the shadows in the stairwell, the old wounds reawakened in brick and blood. All had resolved into something less satisfying than a criminal's capture. It was not closure that filled the silence, but ambiguity. Outside, the city pulsed with unseen life. The soft hiss of a cab's wheel, a distant bell, the creak of timber settling into night. Within, there was only the hearth, the smoke, and Holmes. As still as a sculpture carved from logic, untroubled by the shades that visited me still. Holmes had already resumed his correspondence with the peculiar and, to my mind, slightly mad world of academic inquiry. On his writing desk lay the opening folios of a monograph entitled Subterranean Acoustics in Criminal Engineering, complete with diagrams of flues, echo chambers, and notes scribbled in Latin. Ghosts, he remarked dryly, make excellent cover for bad architecture. I raised an eyebrow. You mean to suggest you never once entertained the idea of the supernatural in this affair? He waved his pipe dismissively. My dear Watson, I have never yet found a haunting that could not be accounted for by physics, guilt, or plumbing. There was a certain elegance in his detachment. Where I saw phantoms and echoes, he saw patterns and causality. It was, I suppose, the reason men sought him out, and the reason I, though weary of the world, still found his company oddly comforting. As Holmes prepared his pipe, with that familiar, meditative economy of motion, I found the weight of silence intolerable. You felt nothing for him, I asked. For Ravi Das, he glanced up, the match flaring in his long fingers. I felt a professional appreciation for his patience and timing. Beyond that, nothing. Come now, Holmes. The man lost a brother. He suffered injustice. Surely there is something in you, some spark of sympathy. He lit the pipe and exhaled a thoughtful plume. Sympathy is a sentiment, Watson, and sentiments are notoriously poor guides. Ravi Das acted outside the law, but within a structure I recognize, the architecture of logic. His methods were coherent, his aim precise. That is all I require. But surely justice, Holmes interrupted, is a concept far too mutable for a man in my profession. It changes shape with the vantage point. What I value is constancy. Logic, once tested, does not flinch. I was silent then. For all my years at his side, I still found myself startled by the chill clarity of his worldview. Then you believe justice was done? I believe truth was illuminated, he said quietly. That is its own kind of justice. The evening had nearly surrendered to midnight when a sudden, singular knock broke the stillness. Holmes froze, pipe halfway to his lips. It was not a loud knock, nor a frightened one, but something about its timing, deliberate and isolated, caused my spine to stiffen. I opened my mouth to speak, but Holmes raised a finger. Well, he murmured, eyes gleaming, it seems the night is not quite done with us. He rose with an energy that belied his earlier detachment, crossing to the door as if he had been expecting the interruption. I followed, pulse quickening, foolishly anticipating another chapter to a tale I thought concluded. And as the latch turned and the door creaked open, I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether peace was ever more than a pause between knockings. As the soft drizzle traced silver streaks down the windows of Baker Street, Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the faint curl of smoke from his pipe spiralling upward like a question mark. Justice, Watson, he murmured at last, rarely walks hand in hand with the law. One is blind and the other merely short-sighted. Our visitor did not seek vengeance. He sought to remind the guilty that memory, like sound, echoes in the hollows of conscience. I studied his profile in the glow of the hearth. You almost sound sympathetic. Holmes glanced sideways. Sympathy clouds the mind, but it sharpens the ear. And this case, my dear Watson, was all about listening, not merely to sounds, but to silences. What do you think? Was Ravi Das a criminal, or a ghost of justice haunting the living? What, in your view, was the single detail that truly unravelled the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're always eager to hear sharp minds at work. Don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And if this case intrigued you, share it with a friend who enjoys puzzles in the dark. The next knock could come at your door.